So welcome again. Today is Friday of the 20th week of Ordinary Time, and I'd like to once again make the most of this Friday to summarize the reflections that we've been doing this week. And we're talking about the role of grace in Christian life. And just briefly, I'll just give certain titles for us to summarize or to encapsulate the reflections of each day. On Monday, we were reflecting on the call to live in grace or to live by grace as that which is uniquely Christian. What qualifies us as Christians, what distinguishes the extra step that Jesus asks us to take is to live by grace, as the qualifying characteristic. On Tuesday, we were reflecting on a life of grace as the constant exercise of receiving life as a gift. That each day is a day where God gives us the gift of life, and it comes as a grace and not as a burden. And we're talking about not just relying on our human effort. Christian life is not about just trying harder, but it's to learn how to rely on grace. Then on Wednesday, we were talking about comparison as something that stops us from experiencing grace. That when God gives us grace and we compare ourselves with others, remember the parable of the workers in the vineyard, or when we compare ourselves with our own past, how we were, how others were, how life was, or even thinking too much about the future and our expectations, then it kind of blocks us from living each day as a grace, of receiving life as a grace each day. So how we are invited to go back to the source of the one to whom we receive that grace, which is God Himself. And yesterday on Thursday, we were talking about the balance of grace and responsibility. That grace makes us able to live our responsibilities or our responsibility with love. That responsibility, more than something that's given to us because of social expectations, responsibility is more so the capacity or the ability to respond with love. And this comes from putting on the wedding garment at the banquet, which is to experience our lives as completely loved by God. And once again, going back to the experience of grace and living our responsibilities each day as a grace from God, receiving the grace from God. Now today, we kind of summarize this experience or reflections on grace by one very concrete practice. We're saying that we need to receive life as a grace, to respond to that grace, but somehow something that stops us is when we become too full of these responsibilities. Not that we should reject them, but we become too full of our cares, our concerns, or our worries with our responsibilities that we don't recognize grace anymore. So today, I would propose this as the daily exercise that we need to do in order to practice living in grace, which is the daily exercise of entrusting our cares to God. In Psalm 55, verse 22. This is a beautiful passage. Psalm 55, verse 22. The psalmist says, "Entrust your cares to the Lord, and He will support you." So this daily exercise of entrusting our cares to God will help us to experience how God is supporting us. In fact, this passage was quoted by St. Peter in the first letter of Peter, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. St. Peter says, "Cast all your cares on Him, because He cares for you." So once again, this life of grace is the awareness, begins with the awareness that there's a God who cares. And when I exercise, when I practice each day entrusting my cares to Him, then I experience that actually He's giving me grace to live each day, and I'm not on my own. There's a pope who was recently canonized, Pope John 23rd. he used to have this practice. If you have read the Journal of a Soul, it's actually his diary of his examinations of conscience every night that he would do, his own reflections. And in this Journal of the Soul, he used to say that every night he would imagine himself as he knelt down to go to sleep. Before he went to sleep, he would imagine himself putting his worries, like the piece of the fragment of the hose. If you notice, the priest will put the fragment of the hose into the chalice, before, when he consecrates the hose and the prayer of consecration, or before communion. And he would imagine himself putting his worries one by one into the chalice of Christ. So in a way, this is my worry. I entrust it to you, Lord. This is also my worry. I entrust it to you, Lord. I'm still worried about this. As I go to sleep, I entrust it to you, Lord. Because what can I do about it now? What I need to do is to rest well, to sleep well, so that tomorrow I can face my concerns and my responsibilities once again. And he was the Pope, so I mean, he had the whole world in his mind. So this practice of entrusting our cares to God will experience that he's the first one who cares about our concerns. So what are your daily concerns? Each day I invite you to just try to classify them, not think about them, okay, not worry more about them, but just to classify them. I think there are three main concerns that I see in my own life and in most people. The first, concern of the relationships. Second, concerns of their responsibilities in life. And thirdly, it's a new concern, and it's a growing concern. It's a concern for health, our own health. I think these three things are very important. Concern for our relationships, concern for our responsibilities, and concern for our own health. And like it or not, they come to us. Relationships with family, with our spouses, with children, with relatives, with co-workers, with our bosses, with our employees, with everyone. Our relationships matter to us, even though we may say, no, that one is not, or this one is. They concern us. We are affected by the way we live our relationships, or others relate to us. So place them and trust them to God. Concerns with our responsibilities. For those who are parents, you're concerned about your children, your responsibility towards your work, your financial responsibilities, your social responsibilities as well, because it affects how you live in society. There's so many different kinds of responsibilities that each one of us might have, and it just comes to our mind, which is good as well to be aware. We need to keep entrusting them as well to God. And concern for our health. As we grow older, we need to be more concerned, and we do become more concerned with our health. But not just our physical health, but as well our emotional health, and also our spiritual health. Just as our bodies become more fragile as we grow older and we become more concerned with our physical selves, so too our emotional selves can become more fragile, and we need to be aware of that. And sometimes our spiritual selves, without being aware of it, we can also become more fragile, and we need new spiritualities, new practices or growth in our spiritual life as well, in order to take care of this health as well, inside of us. So physically, emotionally, spiritually, we need to also entrust these cares to God and allow Him to be the one to tell us how to take care of all these concerns, our relationships, our responsibilities, and also ourselves, our health. Today's gospel is a very typical one that we have reflected a lot upon, and I'd just like to reiterate this passage, which is our daily bread actually as Christians. It's Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. Matthew 22, 34 to 40. It's about the two greatest commandments. Once again, a Pharisee heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, and they put a question to test him. Master, which is the greatest commandment of the law. So if you're saying that we should entrust everything to God, that responsibilities are not just the ones that we choose, so which is the one? And then Jesus teaches us how to prioritize our cares, our concerns, and how to entrust things to God with these commandments. Jesus said, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second resembles it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets also. So Matthew 22, 34 to 40. So once again, these are three aspects: loving God, loving our neighbor, and as ourselves. And it's interesting where Jesus speaks loving God with our hearts, our soul, and with our minds. So this, in other words, with our whole being, our whole selves. When we concentrate our whole lives on loving God, grace, a life of grace, as responding to love God in all things. This is the prayer of this week: to love God in all things and above all things. But I would emphasize in all things, in our work, our responsibilities, in our relationships, in our own taking care of ourselves, that we would make it an act of responding to grace out of love. That this would be a constant exercise that we need to do. So entrusting all these things to God kind of empties our hearts to receive grace once again. When we don't empty ourselves of our cares each day, somehow we are so full already in our minds, in our souls, in our hearts, with our worries and our own sentiments and feelings, and sometimes our exaggerations of things, that we don't allow the grace of God to enter and to guide us. And so how wonderful to learn how to practice living a life of grace, of receiving and responding, but knowing that one of the main obstacles we have is that we carry so much inside. We don't entrust it to God. This act of surrender, if you like, this act of entrusting, that makes us open again to grace. Meaning, God, I trust you. I know you care for me, and I want to experience your providence, your grace. So I give these to you, not because I'm irresponsible, but because I want to experience responding to love, out of love, to your grace. And for those who would like to deepen a little bit more in prayer, I would suggest to you certain verses from the prophet Isaiah, the Bible, the prophet Isaiah, for us to pray a little bit more and to try to understand this concept of grace, of entrusting, and of living by grace. It's Isaiah chapter 30, verse 1, verse 15 and 16, and verse 18. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 30, verse 1, 15 to 16, and 18. I'll just read it to you, and you can just go to these passages to draw from the lesson that the prophet Isaiah was already learning. And we as Christians are also invited to deepen in. It says here, "Woe to the rebellious children, declares Yahweh, who make plans which do not come from me, and make alliances not inspired by me, and so add sin to sin." So what is sin? What is being rebellious? We are all children of God, and we become rebellious when we don't trust in God's grace, because we want to do things for ourselves, by ourselves, and without God. It says, what is the characteristic of these rebellious children who don't live by grace? They make plans that don't come from God, and they make alliances with others, certain contractual relationships, if you like, with others that are not inspired by Him. So we can ask ourselves, do I make plans that don't come from God? And do I exaggerate the importance of certain relationships that are not inspired by Him? Because then that could turn things topsy-turvy, and we emphasize once again our own efforts to take care of things. So this is a very personal meditation, and the balance is very personal as well, and therefore it's an invitation to reflect, in our own lives, how we are living this. How do we make our plans? Do we count on God? And in the relationships that we feel most important and we invest in, are they the ones that are inspired by God, or just inspired because I felt like it? And then verse 15 kind of completes, 15, 16, and 18. It says, your salvation lay in conversion and tranquility, and your strength in serenity and trust. And you would not have none of it. You would have none of it. And in verse 18, he says, but Yahweh is waiting to be gracious to you, for Yahweh is a God of fair judgment. Blessed are all who put hope in him. So here he's saying, your experience of grace, your salvation, came in conversion and stillness. To be still, to recognize the conversion of heart that the Lord is asking of you, and not to try to change things around you first. So, and he says, your strength, if you live your salvation by conversion and stillness, then your strength would be in peace and trust. So what gives us strength to live by grace is first and foremost our trust in God. So in order to trust in God, we need to learn how to live by grace, to experience grace, to experience that it is real and that God gives grace. And how do we do that? Entrusting our cares to God each day, so that we experience grace, and we learn to trust Him, and we find that gives us strength to live our responsibilities each day. And then he says at the end, Yahweh is waiting to be gracious to you. He is just, He is fair, He takes care of everything. And blessed are those who hope in Him. So God is waiting to give us grace, and He's just asking for us to trust in Him and to hope in Him. Not that we don't do anything, but this daily entrusting helps us to do everything according to that grace. So have a blessed weekend this 20th and going to the 21st week, and I hope these reflections have been helpful in their own way for those who have been listening, and thank you for your attention. And let us continue asking, most of all, to learn how to live this life of grace that God wanted to grace us with, to give us in Jesus Christ.